What is going on, everybody? How are y'all doing? Let's make sure that we've got audio levels coming through. Lester, go ahead and say something.
I'm here. Are we live on Run Pass Opinion?
We are live on Run Pass Opinion, recording
Nice.
Bear with me. How are
Nice.
you doing? Salt and Pepper, great
Love
to
it.
see you. Hello. Red Hat Duck, hello to you as
I
well.
think Salt and Pep is Ken Mitchell.
That wouldn't surprise me. I would love to see
pretty
Ken
sure.
participating. Also, as I'm sure you can
I
see,
think
Lester,
that's Ken.
as you can see in the background, I've got my green screen just sort of strewn about as I'm getting ready to just start pumping out some content here in a little bit. Yeah, we've got Ken Mitchell in the chat. Yes, the Den Master himself, Ken. I don't know how the site would persist without you and the work that you do. Like those dens, I mean, first of all, Ken, not just Ken, but Lester, I mean, I remember back when it was Spongy, right? It's not Spoogy.
Spongy had it before Ken. Yeah, Spongy had it before Ken. And then Ken took over and he's kind of carried on tradition and just kind of took it to a whole other level.
Okay.
And then, of course, now we have Jack Sallow jumps in and does stuff once in
Mm-hmm.
a while as well, too. So it's fun.
Thank goodness. Because, Ken, I know that you talked about how, like, you're getting up, you're going through and, like, aggregating links as early as, gosh, like, late into the evening and early in the morning. Thank you, especially during the season, for everything you do and helping keep people informed. Alex, great to see you from New Zealand. Happy that you could come join us. I feel like, Lester, things are basically, what would you say? Like, we are in a valley right now of Bears content, because we're between like early free agency and the actual draft. But I don't know about you, Lester. I am so excited to finally get to the draft so that we can stop thinking about, like, me personally, I still remember the days when I was before I was doing content creation. And I remember back then, Lester, I didn't care about learning anything about draft prospects. I was like, they're going to draft somebody and then I'll learn those people, but not a day earlier. How have you felt about this?
Well, it's kind of cool right now. Like you say, we are in a bit of a valley, but usually there's some more exciting free agency stuff to talk about with the Bears. This has just kind of been a quiet free agency period. So, like you said, it is a valley now. It's a bit of a lull. You know, there's always a bit of excitement when it comes to the drafts and the mock drafts and the prospect interviews, you know, and all that kind of stuff. So it's coming. You know, free agency is slow and steady, but like you, I'm okay with the free agency. I think Ryan Poles is doing a pretty good job addressing some needs with reasonable priced, high upside players.
Oh, yeah. You're going to hear me, Lester, literally repeat this on the podcast. I mean, you guys are getting a live pre-show before we record everything. But what I've always thought is the funny part about maybe not every free agency, but certainly this free agency, Lester, this feels like when you start up Madden Ultimate Team. Now, hopefully everybody in the chat knows what I'm talking about, but if you don't, the gist is Madden Ultimate Team is like a Madden game mode where it starts you with a bunch of flat out scrubs, and then you can go on like auction markets and win different packs, and theoretically you could use like the in-game system to make your team better, but if most people out there are like me, you hit the auction market, you find like the cheapest 80 overalls that you can, and you start improving your team position by position. And one thing, Lester, that I'm really intrigued about is every time the Bears sign somebody like Nicholas Morrow, or when they sign somebody like just recently it was nickel corner Tavon Young from Baltimore, they get a lot better than when most people sign a backup, because they go from, okay, Kendall Vildor's the starting nickel, I guess, to, hey, Tavon Young can kind of play. And in the same way, I'm interested to see just how much better the draft makes them, because I saw somebody, it was Derek Classon on Twitter, saying, okay, the Bears are a terrible roster, and I mean, like, the draft doesn't fix it because every team goes through the draft. But I can't help but think, Lester, about that law of diminishing returns that says that the Cowboys are going to get better, but they may go from A- to A in terms of roster. Results be darned. But the Bears have a chance to go from they do not have an X receiver to they have an X receiver and he might actually be good, and do that across a bunch of positions. You know what I mean? Where they like take the 65 overall that is Dakota Dozier and add a 79 overall instead that has upside. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean the arrow is pointing up for the franchise. I mean, we all went through the Matt Nagy era. We tried making excuses for as much as we could, but we all saw it just dwindling, and it just wasn't working out. And no matter what he did, he just always would just kind of shoot himself in the foot with his decisions. And I think it's just good as Bears fans that we have that fresh perspective, brand new regime, brand new coaching staff, a whole slew of new players to root for. So I think it's a fun time to be a Bears fan. The record may not reflect that, but I think as a fan, I'm excited to see what happens.
I am too. You ready to record this darn thing?
Let's rock.
Let's do it. Okay, so we are officially recording. Pre-tested it. Lester and I have a bad habit, for those who don't know this, where I'll be like, Lester, let's do a show. And he'll be like, you got it. And then we record like an hour and a half show. And then I go, it didn't record. And we'll just do it again. We've done that 2 or 3 times now, Lester. The wild part to me is that we will do the follow-up show. So, yeah, the world of content creation is a funny one. Anyways, I'm ready to go. What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to Bear With Me, a Chicago Bears podcast hosted by yours truly, Robert Schmitz, right here on the Windy City Gridiron podcasting channel. And I am joined by the boss man himself, Lester Wiltfong. It's April 4th. Nothing specific has happened, but it was about time we put something on the channel. Lester, that's about how it feels right now, isn't it? Like, we've got some signings to go through, but it's not as if we're dusting off the breaking news banner every couple of days. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you're off a few days. It's actually April 8th.
Gracious.
So you're living in the past for now with all that stuff going on there at the brand new house, brand new baby.
Big L on my head.
Life gets in the way sometimes of even the dates. It's all good.
Oh my goodness, you have no idea. But the nice thing, look, if I could just open up. Like, let's answer, I think, a question that we've got to start with, Lester. What do we think of Ryan Poles' offseason so far? And I have to walk back some freneticism that I know I purported about 2 weeks ago at the start of free agency, because I, like a lot of people, was so just heads down on we've got to help Justin Fields. We have to surround Justin Fields with talent. And I do still believe that. I'm not about to say that Justin Fields is well surrounded with talent right now, but I know I went through an exercise where I was convinced, Lester, the Bears needed to trade for a wide receiver. And the wide receiver that I had in mind, DK Metcalf would be great if the price for wide receivers wasn't so high, but I had Devontae Parker on my brain. And I went through mock draft scenarios because PFF just recently added the ability to trade for a player. And my thought was I would trade back from 39, pick up a third, trade the third for Devontae Parker. And every time I did, I couldn't justify Parker versus whether it's Alec Pierce or Calvin Austin. Like, the pick that I got was so useful that Parker didn't make any sense anymore. And it suddenly started to really crystallize, in my opinion anyways, that it's possible for Poles to do a lot of what we want him to do through the draft. Obviously, it'll be risky. Not every pick is a hit, and everybody knows that. But that there are big steps forward that this team could make from the draft in particular, that second wave signings, cut candidates will bolster, but this definitely is a tear down season. And at the very least, it doesn't seem like Justin Fields is going to be in quite the predicament that he was last year.
Yeah, I was hoping for a trade for a receiver as well. I wasn't looking to trade something quite as high. I was thinking if they could trade like a late day 3 pick for a vet. I thought that made sense. But like you said, at the end of the day, this team is not competing for a title this season. They're a couple years away. So why would you waste any draft capital on a veteran that's not going to be part of your championship team, once you get there? So, you know what? Yes, it's riskier to go with a third round pick like Alec Pierce than it is to trade for a proven guy that's a proven NFL player. But at the end of the day, it's about that hope. It's about the promise of what you have. And right now, let's see what they have as a franchise, because we're not winning now. It's going to be a couple years down the road. The improvements could come, but a veteran like Parker, as much as I was on board with it as well, for a third round pick, fourth round pick, fifth round pick, If you could have got him for a 7th, yeah, maybe that'll give Justin Fields a nice guy to kind of go to when he had to. But this team needs young talent, and that's what they want.
And it's worth mentioning, Lester, that you just mentioned if they could get him for a 7th. You got to remember what we're talking about here, because I do think this happens all the time, where people look and they say, yeah, if you could get DK Metcalf for a 2nd-round pick, I'd do it. And it's like, whoa, we're talking about a 900-yard, like 1,300-yard cap, 24-year-old receiver. It's going to cost more than that. I mean, all I'm saying is that people tend to devalue what trades should be, because Devontae Parker is, if you take a 17-game season, an 850-yard ex-receiver, and he's only about 29 years old. It's not the world's greatest trade asset, but when you say it like that, it sounds like it's going to cost more than a 7th-round pick, doesn't it? I mean, there's no easy route here. But the bright side is that Poles stated before things started getting wild, that his plan was to wait until 2nd and 3rd wave of free agency. I, like a lot of people, freaked out about the fact that I thought for some reason that it was like, okay, yeah, but at least we're going to get some offensive linemen, right? And then the Bills matched a huge RFA offer in Ryan Bates, and really all we're left with right now is Lucas Patrick. So don't have as much oil help as maybe I would like. I'm not going to lie. That it's something that I am hoping that the right cut candidate or the right price for somebody like J.C. Treader or plenty of the other linemen that are out there comes together. But when I see signings like the Bears recently brought in Tavon Young, nickel corner from Baltimore, that gives them an official starting 3 cornerbacks that isn't just disgusting to look at. They brought in, Ryan Griffin, a former tight end from the Jets, who he's fine, but at the very least, this gives the Bears 2 starting tight ends, so to speak. They've got Anthony Hitchens, former Cowboys Flus linebacker that also played on the Chiefs, coming in, could be a potential Sam or Mike linebacker. They've got enough players swirling around at this point that, I mean, it's going to sound silly, Lester, but this is like watching your Madden Ultimate Team go from 65 overall players up to 79 or 80 or even 75 overall players. It's not a great jump for most teams, but when your earlier starting nickel was Kendall Vildor, Tavon Young is a big jump in the right direction. You know what I mean?
Yeah, if you look at the guys at linebacker right now, you have Roquan, and then you have the guy they signed Morrow. But if they do get a guy like Hitchens in here, that's a culture signing. He's a guy that comes in. He knows the Matt Eberflus system. He knows how he expects the players to act, and he knows the defense. So you sign a guy like him, and like I said, right now he's just visiting. He came to Hallis Hall on Thursday, but it makes sense. You know, if you connect the dots, he knows Poles from his time in KC. He knows Matt Eberflus from his time in Dallas. Perfect signing. Still relatively young. Not the best player, but he knows the scheme. He knows the system. And if the worst case scenario is you sign him and he ends up being one of your top reserves, that's a win for the franchise.
Absolutely. I mean, again, it's just about making sure that the Bears have, to some extent, Lester, it could be as simple as warm bodies at some of these positions, but it's about picking up guys. I mean, you've got plenty of corners on the market. They're not exciting names, don't get me wrong, but there are options out there at offensive line, at corner. They brought in, oh my word, is it Cruikshank?
Cruikshank.
Perfect. Dane Cruikshank, who I know our own EJ Snyder is very excited about. And even at safety, there are still options out there, whether you go in the draft with a guy like Brian Cook or you sign a guy like Tyrann Mathieu. I mean, it's easy to forget that the dust hasn't totally settled on guys that we would even still consider good players, like the 29-year-old center, J.C. Treader. It's just a matter of seeing how the money's going to work. And right now, we haven't seen any void years. We haven't seen anything that suggests that Poles and their new or the guy that they brought back, is it Line A?
Stein, yeah.
Or Stein, thank you, because it used to be Line A, and I was like, I know I'm getting these names confused. But they don't seem to want to shift money forward into the future, which means that we should see sort of an all-out approach to free agency next year. But this year, it's as much about cobbling a team together and making the money work as anything else.
It's all about finding guys that are NFL starter level. Not all pros, not pro bowlers, guys you feel they can come in and start and be a professional football player for this season.
Right.
And you mentioned a guy like Cruikshank. He started, I think, 4 games for the Titans last year. He's not a guy you look at and say, yeah, he's a clear-cut starter, but he started. If he had to start, he could start for you. Same with DeAndre Houston Carson. He started a few games last year. If he has to start next to Eddie Jackson, if that's the guy that wins the job, you're comfortable as a defense knowing you got a guy that you can at least trust to a point. He has some limitations, of course, but now you have options. So this is what this offseason is. The free agencies are options. A guy like Tavon Young at nickel. I never even thought of him until the Bears signed him. I'm like, oh, that makes total sense. He has some injury issues in the past, but I think just 3 years ago, he was signed to a big money deal as the highest paid nickel in the game. So the talent is there. He's had a couple ACL injuries. I think he had a neck injury. He played all 17 games last season. Maybe he's healthy. At the very least, like you said, he's an upgrade at nickel over what the Bears have had a season ago.
You go from that 64 overall up to
75,
75, 79, maybe with some upside. Yeah. But I could go on a whole diatribe about how excited I am about Thomas Graham, but we'll save that for another podcast, because in a world where you play the kids, right, I think you're more likely to find gem UDFAs purely because they get playing time, and gem old picks from other pieces of the regime. Graham could easily fit in this cover 2 defense, and as a former 6th round pick with a couple more years of control, that's a good thing. Our own Ken Mitchell brought up something that I think is really interesting and important to talk about, because I've seen comments about how Poles hasn't done anything exciting or impressive. Super fair. He hasn't done anything. Truth be told, fundamentally speaking, he hasn't had his first draft yet. So if you're not impressed, that's normal. But this time last year, Ryan Pace brought us a very expensive Andy Dalton, who has now found a new team. The year before that, he paid a lot of money for Nick Foles, who has yet to find a new team. There is truth to the idea. It's Masters weekend. I'll make a comparison here, Lester, that doing nothing is like playing it safe, and doing the wrong thing just puts you in the rough. And sometimes the answer isn't to try to take the shot over the trees. It's to just lay it up on the fairway, take a shot that you can follow up, instead of trying to be a superhero and digging yourself into a hole. A lot of teams will fight to be, what would you say, 9-8, 10-7, that the goal is to quote unquote sneak into the playoffs and quote unquote see what happens. And the Raiders got obliterated. A lot of these teams that do that, the Bears only 2 years ago got annihilated by the Saints. It's not a winning recipe. And so to see the Bears at the very least not overcommit to something that they shouldn't be involved with, but instead set up for the future, it makes a lot of sense. It just makes me uncomfortable about what Justin Fields is going to do next.
Was that a Tin Cup reference you worked in there?
Where?
Tin Cup? That's the Kevin Costner movie, Tin Cup.
Wasn't that what? If it was on accident.
You'll have to watch it. If you've never seen it, it's a pretty good golf movie. It's got Cheech in there as well, so go check that out. So, I'm with you, though. I think that if you look at Ryan Pace, his off seasons were more exciting. But what was the Bears' record the last few years? They were hovering around 500. Of course, last year it kind of fell apart. So this approach by Ryan Poles, not exciting, not sexy. But this team does not need exciting and sexy right now. They need stable, professional players. And as you mentioned, Justin Fields, the biggest thing that's going to help Justin Fields improve as a quarterback is getting Matt Nagy's offense out of here. Luke Getsy's scheme, let's just take a look at Mitch Trubisky, that 4-game stretch where the Bears committed to doing more boot slide concepts. They didn't have that entire offense put in, but Trubisky looked competent in that 4-game stretch. Once you came up against, the Packers, the Saints, of course, he did not look the same guy. But when you played those bad defenses, he looked pretty good. Now let's take that. That's going to be a basis of what now Justin Fields is doing. He's on the move, run the ball, play action. This all plays well with what he wants to do as a quarterback, because he wants to run the play action, take a little time, look downfield, take a deep shot, loosen things up, commit to the run. They got to build the O-line a little bit. I think another vet's coming. Maybe 2 veterans are coming. He'll address it in the draft for sure. So there's not one doubt in my mind that the Bears offense will be better than it was the last few years when it was a bottom 3rd offense every year under Matt Nagy.
Oh, for sure. And hey, Lester, at the risk of saying something almost blasphemous, it is possible for Justin Fields to develop even without a ton of help around him. I mean, it doesn't sound realistic, right? I mean, that would be the breeding ground for bad habits, and it would be. But it's worth remembering that Deshaun Watson at one point led the Texans to a 4-12 season, and nobody thought he was secretly bad. Right? Nobody really started asking questions. They said the Texans are absolutely terrible. I can't believe that he's doing what he's doing with this roster, and even so, they're still losing games. Fields, if he can get like some draft help, I don't want to pigeonhole anything, because then if I say they're going to go lineman and receiver in the first 2 rounds, of course they're going to draft a linebacker and a defensive tackle, right? But if they get that extra wide receiver in the draft, who we're not thinking will be Jamar Chase, right? We're probably looking at a 600-yard receiver if he has a really good year. But even just adding talent within a changed scheme and stabilizing the offensive line a little bit will give Justin Fields enough to take a step forward. Will he suddenly be an MVP candidate? Probably not, just due to the weapons and the talent around him. That argument still matters. But, I mean, we did this dance with Trubisky for a while too, Lester. Fields shouldn't need 10 All-Pros around him just to show that he can take a step forward. Darnell Mooney will be in his 3rd year. He just cracked 1,000 yards. Byron Pringle is a legitimately solid slot option. Not anything more than a wide receiver 3 at best in your pecking order, but still helpful. I mean, we're coming out of the Nagy offense, which I know you and I are both really excited about. It doesn't mean that it'll be a banner year. It may not even mean that he cracks 4,000 yards, but things like don't jump and try to throw a screen pass over a defensive tackle that's already on you. Things like hold on to the ball and don't fumble, 11 times. Things like completing the plays that he was so close to creating on 3rd downs and 2nd downs that seemed to fall a foot or 2 shy for one reason or another. I think we can see a lot of that, and the offense itself may still not be healthy or even good, but not dead last in pass attack is sort of the bar here, and I think that's something he could probably clear.
I think you nailed it. The bar is really, really low. And not just compared to what's happened with Nagy era, compared to Bears quarterbacks throughout history, the bar is really, really low. If there's a chance if Justin Fields plays all 17 games, and of course he has to prove that first. He's obviously had some injuries last year, but if he does that, 3,800 yards is nothing for a professional quarterback. That's the Chicago Bears franchise record. You know, Justin Fields could have a very, very basic, boring year and break the Bears record. It's just a weird thing to think about, but it's possible.
Oh, it's totally possible, especially since you got to think that they're going to move to a little bit more of what Fields wants to do. I mean, Nagy's West Coast scheme, I thought for sure. I mean, given that I think I had one of the longer leashes on Matt Nagy, maybe out of anybody associated with the Bears media, I learned a lot about offense through the rise and demise, if you will, of Matt Nagy, and how not everything, just because it's explainable, is good, especially when it comes to the difference between teaching something, which Nagy's staff really struggled with, versus the ideated plan, right? But Justin Fields would have, or let's put it this way, Russell Wilson would have struggled just as much in Matt Nagy's scheme. He might not have made some of the downright stupid rookie errors that Fields made, but Russ wasn't a West Coast thrower either, right? Russ prefers routes where the receivers are moving. Russ prefers a lot of play action. Russ prefers to throw the ball beyond 20 yards if he can on just about any given play. And a lot of that profile matches pretty well with Fields. So if Getsy can take, it's funny because I've been going through some Packers tape, which, you know, watching the Packers succeed is the worst, but it's hilarious, Lester, because half of the Packers offense is going to port straight over to the Bears. A lot of the play action stuff, a lot of the bunch sets, a lot of the way that they disguised things and worked out of stuff. And then, especially on 2nd and 3rd downs, suddenly they would shift to West Coast, and I was like, that's Rodgers. Like, there was a piece of this offense you can tell that was Rodgers stuff, and he was good at it. Of course he would be. But I think that we'll see a better cohesion. Is it going to be perfect? It doesn't need to be. I think it was somebody in our comments just a little while ago that said, if they can even be 50% cohesive, that's 50% more than it was last year. And I wish we weren't overstating it. You know what I mean?
It's such a a ridiculous comment, but it's true. I mean, there was so many mistakes last year with the Nagy offense as far as the penalties, the timeouts, then a penalty after the timeout. I think the Bears, that was like their staple, but there is so much stuff, there's so much stuff that happens within what Luke Getzey's bringing from the Packers. The one thing you didn't mention is his pass protection. They're going to scheme up ways to protect. Whereas last year we saw too many times the tackles were left on an island. We saw too many times it was 5-man protection. We saw too many times where the running back, you don't know whose fault it is. A lot of times you're not sure which way he's supposed to go, but it seemed like he went the wrong way. I know with Khalil Herbert, he had some issues with this. Montgomery was better in pass pro, but now with Herbert, he's in his second year. He'll get better at that area. So they're gonna scheme the protection better. They're gonna scheme up more open receivers. They're going to get Fields on the move. They're going to run the play action, which will help slow things down from the pass rush. And they seem like they're going to commit to run a little bit more because, like you said, they signed Ryan Griffin, who is another inline blocking tight end. They also signed Kerry Blasingame, who was a fullback. So they're building pieces on this offense to where you might look at it and say, hey, maybe they're going to try and do a little more of the downhill running stuff, which will let Fields then work those bootlegs off it.
Mm-hmm. And at the very least, Lester, look, okay, I'll bring something up that could start a fire, and I hope it doesn't, right? But
that's your thing, though. You always do that. I love it.
Do, don't I? Okay. But anyways, let's talk about Cole Komet, even just a little bit, because I think he's a great example of just how important scheme can be, right? Cole Komet caught for 600 yards, and it's I think Jonathan Wood's doing some work on him right now. Cole Komet did not play particularly well against man, but he caught 600 yards, especially against zone defenses, because whether it was victimizing a linebacker or even just running to a spot, an inline tight end can get open purely because they are an inline tight end sometimes, and it's, I don't want to say easier, but they can attack pockets of the field that are left a little bit more vulnerable than defensive backs will often leave things. And I bring this up purely to say that Ryan Griffin being signed doesn't necessarily mean that the Bears are going to run the ball more often. It might just mean that they're going to gesture as if they're going to run the ball more often. I mean, let's not forget the impact Robert Tonyan had on that Packers offense, which was frustrating for Bears fans because he would just show up at all of the wrong times and collect a lot of yards. There's a little bit, at least I am excited about the idea that whether it's more tight ends, because this is actually a great tight end class, the Bears could get a cool tight end in the 4th, 5th, 6th, or 7th round. But like the Bears could do a lot more, let's say, formations that make sense. And there's a lot of tight end usage that correlates really well with selling play action. I mean, you can't line up in 5 wide and run play action and expect it to work, obviously. So run heavy formations tend to marry that idea really well. So I'm loving it because whether they run the ball more or not, the impression I get is that they want to have Justin Fields start with that deep fake handoff, turn around. Your receivers have had the extra 2.5 seconds to get downfield and launch that ball. That's an offense that I could get behind very, very quickly.
I'm a fan of the tight end position. I like watching good tight end play. And Cole Komet, he is not a good tight end yet, but he's very young.
And he's super young. And he's got good straight line speed. It sounds like we're dunking on him. Like,
no, he's a decent football player, but a lot of fans, and what we see a lot is because of where he was drafted. You know what? I look at draft status. Once they're picked, that's out the window. Once you put that Bears jersey on and you step on the field at Hallis Hall, now you have to produce. Whether you're a second rounder, an undrafted free agent, wherever you are, you have to produce at that point. And then especially now, the regime that drafted Cole Komet is gone. There are no ties to him into the old regime. So I think we're going to see Cole Komet, who, like you said earlier, was not very efficient in what he did last year. The drops were too high. He didn't get, there were no chunk plays. He was just basically a guy that a lot of guys could have got those yards or empty yards. But I think he's a good enough player where, like you mentioned, with the scheme, he's going to sneak around in those split zone play action plays where he goes back over the top or comes back underneath the formation. They're going to sneak him out into the flat. And if all he is just a check down guy that is there when you need him to be, he's pretty decent with the ball in his hands. I mean, he's tough to bring down. He has to hold on to the ball and he has to run, straight and make those plays, but he's not Adam Shaheen. He's at least he has a somewhat of an athletic composure with him. He can do some things. I'm not expecting a Pro Bowl out of him ever, but I am expecting him to be a solid football player for the Bears and for at least another couple of years until his contract's up.
He's young. I think we have a tendency to overrate other tight ends. For instance, people make a Kyle Rudolph comparison, and I'm kind of with you. Like, schematically speaking, it's not as if I saw Cole Comet rip off some massive play where he got wide open, but 600 yards speaks for itself. I mean, there are like 5 good tight ends, truly. Like, think about it from a fantasy perspective for anybody who plays fantasy football. There's like 5 to 8 tight ends that you actually want to draft, and then there's 24 open spots to be a top 30
mix and match
to be a top 32 tight end. Exactly. So, like, whether Komet's not going to be a U, he's not going to be a superstar. At least I don't think so. He's not going to be a word I've heard used a lot as a unicorn. But I specifically bring him up just to say, Lester, that scheme and what a player's stated position is, like an inline tight end, can actually generate a lot more production than I think people realize sometimes. And a lot of people will hang like production entirely on talent, and I don't always think that's fair. Because there are plenty of cases. For instance, let's take Darnell Mooney. He just had over 130 targets, like way too many targets for somebody like Darnell Mooney, and caught 1,000 yards. Does that mean that I think that he got over-targeted? I do. But also, he only collected 7.5 yards per target, which I think is in part because he was the only receiver worth covering. So as his targets come down, which they're not going to come down too far, Lester, I was looking at Darnell Mooney's second season compared to a lot of other Z receiver second seasons, and he had more than Tyler Lockett. And we're talking yards per game. Like, he had more yards per game than Tyler Lockett. He had more yards per game than Robert Woods, and his yards per game was about 4 or 5 short of Calvin Ridley, Stephon Diggs, and even Cooper Kupp. That's not to say that Mooney's going to be at that level, but I do wonder...
You just said he's the next Cooper Kupp.
No.
That's going to be all across Twitter
Lester,
by tomorrow morning.
What I am saying is that Darnell Mooney might be being underrated just a little bit, because we've heard so much he's a good number 2 that it's taught us that I'm expecting a 600 to 700 yard receiver, and I think Mooney will more than likely hover around the 8.5 to 1,100 mark for basically the rest of his career, with more than likely a healthy 105 to 110 targets a year. What do you think?
He's 5'11", 185 or 175. He needs to put on some more mass. And, he's working out with Justin Fields the whole offseason. He may have put on some good weight. It looked like it on the clips on the IG, what the kids all watch there. It looked like he bulked up a touch. I'm interested to see what he weighs in at. I mean, if he can come, 190-ish, I mean, if he adds a little bit of muscle, we're so focused on what he isn't.
Yeah.
He's a damn good receiver. He's a good route runner. He has great speed. He obviously has the trust of the QB1, so that's in his favor. So if he maxes out as a really damn good slot guy for you, I think that's fine. He's not Julio Jones. They play different games. Right. I know when a lot of fans think of a wide receiver 1, we think of a guy like that, AJ Green, Julio Jones, Brown with the Titans. That's who we look at, a big physical presence. That's not his game. He can be a top receiver for the Bears and still not crack that wide receiver 1 echelon, but that's okay. He's quality.
Mm-hmm. I think so. Absolutely. And frankly, I think maybe an understanding of who Mooney is really key here, because Lester, we got to talk about the draft. We've got to talk about what's coming up, because there are some guys out there that the Bears may sign, but I think you and me pining over who they could potentially bring in is about as useless as that sounds. What really matters is that we know they've got at least 3 day 3 picks, top 100 picks, and potentially more. Let's talk about it on the other side of this break. So we'll step away for commercial, and Bears fans, don't go anywhere. We'll see you in just a little bit. And we are back with Bear With Me. I'm here with Lester Wiltfong as we are going to get into some draft theory. I want to make this clear. We're not talking specific picks. Not only does Lunch Pill Draftcast do a great job, but we're going to be covering that a little bit later as we get up to the draft. I know I am still finishing draft prep myself, though if you keep your eyes on Run Pass Opinion, my YouTube channel, you'll see an Alec Pierce breakdown here shortly. Definitely going to put something at least up about Tyler Smith. Let me know what other players you want to see, like very or like drilled down breakdowns about. But Lester, I do think there's something to be said for, we can talk in platitudes. We can say offensive line, trade down, so on and so forth. As you look at the team right now, what are you thinking of the positions that you need to prioritize, and how would you go about prioritizing them?
I think this draft plays into well what the Bears need. They need a receiver, and they need some more depth in the O-line. And those two positions are fairly deep. Where, I mean, you talked about earlier, you don't want to pigeonhole them into taking those two spots in the second round. But the way the board's going to fall, those may be your best picks to go there. Whether it's wide out first, O-line second, or vice versa, you have to weigh your board. But, I talked about it on the last show I was on. And, if you look at the top 40 picks, there's only been 8 wideouts ever. That's the most been taken in that span there. The Bears are going to get a pretty quality receiver, because this draft class, you can rattle off guys in that 10 to 15, 10 to 16 range. You're thinking, yeah, they have really good upside. A guy like Pierce is in there, a guy like Sky Moore is in there. There's some quality receivers that if the Bears just stay put, let the board come to them, take the best guy there, whether it's Watson from, he's another guy that could be there when the Bears pick a 39, pick the best player available. And then maybe with the next pick on, 48, 49, maybe now you look to trade back. And that's something Ryan Poles talked about. He talked about the analytics of trading back. This is really cool to hear him talk about this, where he understands that there's value in moving back, but you got to do it if you have the right group of players available. If you have a certain amount of players you really want, I know Ryan Pace talked about that was his cloud of players, but he would not really follow through with that. He would screw that up. If you have a cloud of 10 players that you feel comfortable picking at this spot, then let's trade back six or 7 spots. You'll still get one of those guys you want, and now you're picking up an extra pick. I think Ryan Poles will trade back one of those second-round picks for sure.
I love that image of the cloud.
The cloud of players.
It's such a cloud. But yeah, I agree with you. If anything, Lester, I actually think that the Bears might be better suited to trade back from 39 and stick at 48 no matter what. The way that I've seen it is somebody explained it to me this way, right? They said, okay, the first 10 picks in round 2 are basically first round picks in the eyes of those that trade up. And I said, what in the world are you talking about? And they said, well, you think about it. So the whole first round takes an entire day, and then everybody goes home. They go back to their war room. They say, okay, Tevin Jenkins slid into the second round. What do we think we can do to get them? And all the people start pounding tables, and it's not 15 minutes per pick anymore. You know for a fact that these guys are going to be available. And if you don't
7 minutes in the round 2.
Yes, but a whole evening to prepare, a whole afternoon to make phone calls, just like the Bears had for lined up for, yes, Tevin Jenkins, but also Justin Fields, that you can work out a lot of these trades early. I do think that this will take a bit of an iron stomach, Lester, because you can't trade up and also not have a player worth trading up for. So if the Bears are going to trade back, it's going to mean that whether it's an edge rusher that's fallen, or even scarier, could be a guy like George Pickens that Bears fans want, could be a guy like Tyler Linderbaum that Bears fans want. There are silly players to pass on, Linderbaum probably being one of them, maybe even Pickens, but there are going to be players that other teams want. And I think, personally, if the Bears could move back into the mid-50s, maybe late 40s, we might be surprised at just how helpful that would be, because then you still get 48, you get another pick just a couple of picks later, and you probably add a third-round pick, maybe even like a 6th or 7th, to just keep adding depth to that Bears offense.
You mentioned the Pro Football Focused mock draft simulator. That's what I do. Whenever I go on there, I kind of see what it is. I go to there's a site, I can't remember the site, but they show you the draft charts. The Jimmy Johnson, I think there's a Spielberger chart now, right? Isn't there? There's a whole bunch of different draft charts, point charts, and I look at the values of them. And like you said, those earlier picks do carry much more weight in the eyes of analysts and on the teams, because another reason is, how many times do you watch a first round and how many guys are picked and you're saying, I never thought he would go that high. It happens all the time. There's guys that go way too high that armchair analysts think. There's guys that fall that no one thinks.
Just so wait when all these guys Seahawks get on the board. It's
exactly,
every year.
Yeah. They're going to take something ridiculous. You're like, well, that makes no sense, but it makes sense for them. There's 32 teams and all 32 boards are differently. Some teams may not value a guy like George Pickens because they may not have a need for that type of receiver. They may have a guy like Sky Moore on their board higher because that fits their scheme better. Everyone's board is differently. The board falls differently for everyone. You're going to see some surprises. And like I said, if they stay put, they'll get quality. But if you're going to trade back, that's the best spot to do it from.
And speaking of players, because you mentioned guys like Sky Moore, you've talked about other receivers, I feel like there's a real double-edged sword here. So first of all, receiver got really expensive this year. So I think, especially as we've now seen the Vikings drafted Justin Jefferson and he exploded. The Bengals, maybe more importantly, drafted Jamar Chase. And whether fairly or not, Lester, I think a lot of people see drafting Jamar Chase as what took them from not even in the playoffs to now they're in a Super Bowl, which may not be fair, but it's the way a lot of people are seeing it. Wide receiver, I think, is about to become an incredibly hot commodity, and that means the Bears have got to make sure that they don't just take a wide receiver, but they need to take the right wide receiver. Me personally, Lester, I think Sky Moore rules. Like Sky Moore, Jahan Dotson, there are a lot of good players that I can think of that could be there in that second round that are such obvious Z wide receivers to me, maybe even slot wide receivers, that drafting them with Darnell Mooney on the team and Equanimous St. Brown currently slated to start at X receiver just seems kind of silly. I mean, in my opinion, and it's just my opinion, this comes down to George Pickens, Christian Watson, and Alec Pierce. And I'm not even going to place a ranking on those. I've got one in my head, but that's not even the point of this discussion. I can't help but feel like the Bears need to get one of them just to make their offense go. Because while there are some really solid receivers out there like Jalen Tolbert that could probably play a little bit of X, maybe you try to see if you could get Romeo Dobbs out of Nevada to play X. Like, you could get some guys that might hold water, but if it was me, that's such a roster hole that I'm gonna be really interested to see what Poles does. Score one for the chat who said that a Pace Poles accident would happen. It did, but whether it's with 48, with 39, or with like that second round pick in the mid 50s, I would seriously consider overdrafting somebody like Alec Pierce at 55-ish. He's currently slated to be like 75 just to make sure I got somebody, because they need somebody. And if they don't come away with one, that's going to be incredibly disappointing, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think getting thing with the receiving core, you want different body types. One guy do different things. I mean, the X is traditionally a bigger, stronger player. He's on the line, so you want a guy that can understand that role. But in the NFL, you're moving around anyways. But it is nice to have those different types of players, so that way, if as a defensive back, you have to deal with different body types. You have to deal with the guy like Mooney. You have to deal with the guy who's bigger and taller, more physical. So not all corners follow receivers around. They play their side for the most part. So if you can attack a guy with speed, this series, the next series, you're attacking him with a guy who's 6'5", that's what you want. It's kind of similar to what teams do with the tailback spot. You have a bruiser and you have a guy that's a bit smaller and a bit shiftier. It's about the linebackers now have to tackle different players. It's about the perspective they have when they're attacking an offense. Is now, okay, this guy is a bruiser. He's going to come at me in this hole. Now it's a guy like Cohen. Okay, this guy's going to go outside more. So it's all about having different options as an offense to attack a defense. And I think the Bears, partly because their roster is so bare right now, they can go a lot of different directions and find a guy that doesn't fit what they currently have.
Yep, absolutely. But then there's that question, right, of prioritization. I mean, I agree with everybody out there that says that you got to go best player available, right?
Yeah.
But that there is a means there. You can't take Matt Ariza, the punter out of San Diego State, that our own Jacob Infante just did a For the Brand breakdown on Windy City Gridiron. You can't take him in the third round just because he's the best player happenstantially on punter. Like, positional value, the guys that you need on your team, all that stuff matters. So I'll hit you with another question here, Lester. How much are you prioritizing something like offensive line or even just offensive needs over defense? At what state, say that Devontae Wyatt, who, in case you don't know the name, is currently slated to go anywhere from 17th to 22nd as a defensive tackle. That would be a perfect 3-tech, but he should be a first rounder. For some reason, he slides to 39. He's the clear best player available and fits the scheme, but Bears really need offensive line. They really need wide receiver. At what stage, how heavy does the weight need to be on a defensive player in favor of your offensive selections to see polls potentially add to the defense early?
That's a good question. I think like you said, a lot of it comes down to their board. It's got to be how they have their board stacked. And if they feel like a top guy falls that plays a position where it may not be a spot they need, but it's a damn good football player sitting there. Now you got to work the phones and look to trade back, because if you take the DT at that spot, he's definitely going to be a good player for the Bears. But can you take that position, trade back? Someone else has him now on their team, but now you have an extra draft pick that you're going to have there in the third round possibly. So it's all options. And I think with the Bears, again, we talked about wideouts, we talked about O-line, pretty deep. So I think the trade back, everyone wants to trade back. Every team wants to move back and pick up picks. It's much easier said than done. Okay. But even if they don't trade back, if they pick a linebacker or a D tackle with that first pick, if it's truly the best player on the board, then now Ryan Poles has to go back to the drawing board as far as his free agency pickups and work the wire, because once the draft happens, what's next? Now teams start cutting veterans that they want to have, make room for these young players. So there'll be quality out there somewhere. Ryan Poles just has to find them.
And like you're saying, I mean, it could be very possible that somebody like that falls. Again, we just don't know. I mean, Tevin Jenkins was considered an obvious 23, 24, 25 pick. And when
Bears fans wanted him at 20.
Yeah, I mean, that was considered a lock, and then he fell. I don't think Wyatt will fall, but I know that what I think doesn't really matter. The draft board is almost just this living, breathing thing that we just can't really predict, and people do their best, but you get the idea. I'm very intrigued to see what happens. I do think that defensive tackle is the need, capital N need, that Bears fans can forget about sometimes. I think they need help at offensive line, whether guard or tackle. I think that's kind of in the eye of the beholder. They need help at wide receiver, and they need that 3-tech. The 3-tech's just rare. I mean, I think it was you and me that were talking about it, Lester. They just don't make them like they used to, if you will. Most guys are either space eater, nose tackles. They're outside, defensive ends. There's a lot of edge rushers out there, but there's just not a lot of 3-techs, and the teams that need one draft them early. So I'm really curious to see what happens at that specific position, because right now, I'm just not certain that Justin Jones is their be-all, end-all solution, though he did get a decent chunk of change.
I haven't done a ton of stuff looking at defensive tackles, but the few I've looked at that I think could be there around the Bears range, it's a pretty deep class as well. There's some pretty good linemen for the Bears to look at this year. But I just think with the way the Bears' current roster is structured, with the way they have a defensive-minded head coach, he's putting in a system he truly believes in. I can see them getting by this first season with culture guys, realizing, hey, we're going to bring in guys that we trust, we believe in, that will help lay the foundation for the scheme in year one. And then next season, we'll try and add more guys in the draft. I really think this draft will be offense heavy, but like you said, I would not be surprised. It all depends how the board falls.
I can't help but keep thinking about, just the other day, one of our friends had me on his podcast, and it included a Cowboys draft preview. right? And as I went through my work for the Cowboys, trust me, Bears fans, this will make sense. I couldn't help but realize that they were a team very similar to the 2018 Bears, where you could, as EJ would say it, roll the ball out and play a game today, and they would be very, very good. It's not to say that the draft doesn't matter for a team like that, but it's more to say that you got bigger questions like Dak Prescott, like what are you going to do? But the big reason I bring up the Cowboys here is because what we saw in their defense, the turnaround that took place, should be a nice reminder that if the Bears do go offense heavy, because most offensive players take a year, sometimes two, to really gel and find their footing, defensive players, not so much. Roquan Smith, plug and play. Micah Parsons, plug and play. We see defensive superstars just emerge out of nowhere almost all the time. And sure, there are some namely DB is a position that a lot of guys have to grow into, but defensive tackles, you're good just about out of the gate, or kind of like we saw with Solomon Thomas, maybe you're just not going to find it. So if the Bears do wait until next year to get that elite 3-tech in their eyes, maybe it'll be an elite receiver, certainly could be. But I can't help but think, Lester, that it's not a coincidence that we saw Tavon Young, a nickel corner, and Anthony Hitchens in for a visit, a linebacker, that we're seeing a lot of these defensive one-year signings. Nicholas Morrow, Justin Jones. You get some offense, but I don't think it's a coincidence that a lot of those defensive stopgaps are showing up on that side of the ball and that there are these gaping holes on offense. I can't help but think that it's a very obvious offensive skew to the draft on its way.
It should be. I mean, if you look at who they signed, in free agency, it's filling needs and it's plugging holes. And that's what they're doing on defense. And, we talked about, the guys you mentioned, also Dane Cruikshank, and they brought back, one of the few guys they brought back from the old regime, DeAndre Houston Carson, So there's some guys. Yeah, there's some guys that they're comfortable. Like I said, it's all about how comfortable are you? Are you comfortable putting this guy as a starting safety? Yeah. I mean, is he the best? No, but he has the youth on his side. He still has some room to grow as a football player, and playing that position, you play it as much with your attributes physically and mentally as well. So maybe these guys are a little better. Maybe they'll play a little better. And then in this scheme with this, the hits philosophy, I'm excited to see how they all come together.
Mm-hmm. And like you said, Lester, it's as much about expectations as it is anything. Do I think that Dane Cruikshank is going to start and immediately become an all-pro? No. I don't. Do I think that he's going to go out there and embarrass himself in the Eberflus Cover 2 system? No, I think he can hold water, and that's the key, at least to what I'm seeing in a lot of these signings. Because
the Bears started Tease Tabor last year at safety for a game. You know what I'm saying? These guys are upgrades over Tease Tabor. Like I said, this team will be better. It may not reflect to the record, but this team will be better.
And it'll be young. More than likely. I've been thinking about this. I would love to see the Bears double dip at offensive line and wide receiver. I mean, more than likely, we're not going to see two early wide receivers. There was a day and age where I thought that might be the case. I don't think that's likely. My guess would be if I got to make things go my way, right? I think the Bears could trade back. They've got 4 day 3 picks. They go 3 on offense, 1 on defense. So you'd be looking at like a defensive tackle or a safety, maybe in like the 3rd round. But then you'd get a wide receiver, that X receiver. You would get either the best lineman available, right? I think Larry Borom looked dramatically better than a 5th round pick should. I also don't think you need to hand him the starting role. I don't even think you need to hand Tevin Jenkins the starting role. I mean, you and I used to joke about how dumb it is that like a 1st round talent gets drafted and, we got to make him earn his position. But a guy like Borom in particular, if he's your swing tackle, your line's pretty solid. It would be much better to have a swing tackle that we could rely on rather than somebody goes down and we go, oh my word, Lachavius Simmons is coming into the game. What on earth are we going to do? So I'm curious to see whether they draft a tackle, whether they draft a guard, guys like Cole Strange, Dylan Parham, Zach Tom, Tyler Smith. There are a lot of guards in this draft.
There are a lot of guards
that actually fit what I think the Bears want to do. And that's a really good thing because as it stands, they don't really have a right guard. It was supposed to be Ryan Bates. It's not Ryan Bates. Which, by the way, really cool to see the transparency that we got from Poles there about just how disappointed he was that the Bates move didn't work out. It was, I don't know, for me anyways, I thought it was a cool moment of vulnerability that we don't normally get from GMs. But I'm very interested to see what happens. They might find a tight end in a stacked tight end class. They might pick up a second. I wouldn't be surprised to see another wide receiver in the 5th, 6th, or 7th round should they add one through the draft. There are some late round guys like Bo Melton, like Romeo Dobbs, depending on how far he falls, like Tyquan Thornton out of Baylor, that you could just add and go and see what happens. The nice thing is they've got their Z, they've got their slot, and it's just a matter of they got to add an X so that they've got a whole receiver room. But like you said, Lester, DK Metcalf doesn't sit out on X on his own either. Like, he shuffles around. Darnell Mooney's had a little too much experience playing X receiver since Marquise Goodwin and Damiere Byrd were the only people like next to him when Allen Robinson couldn't play. So I'm interested. I'm more optimistic than I thought I would be at this stage. And honestly, I think this draft is very key, right? If Poles gets this right, the Bears could actually be very competitive in 2023 and very, very competitive in 2024. If he gets this wrong, could be a minute. So he's betting all his chips on the draft. I'm curious to see what happens next. Any final thoughts on the draft before we take a question or two?
No, I mean, the draft is going to be fun. I mean, it's always fun for Bears fans, but this year especially because it's a new regime. And then we're also going to have to talk about the undrafted free agent market. Right now, the Bears still have the fewest players signed to the roster. They have the most open spots of any other team right now. So you're going to see them, depending on what they sign here the next couple weeks, they're going to have a lot of spots to fill, a lot of young talents going to come in. They're going to see an opportunity in Chicago where they can come in and compete because there's not a lot of guys on the roster. And, you know, you're going to see Matt Eberflus target in that UDFA market, young, hungry, athletic hustlers. That's what you're going to see him bring in. It's going to be, you know, as fans that go to camp, we're going to love seeing it because we're going to see these guys all over the place, and we're going to fall in love with so many of these young UDFA types. It's going to be crazy. They're going to be like Ryan Nall all over again. We're going to love all these guys.
Ryan Nall, now a Cowboy.
Brand new Cowboy. There he is.
Hey, at least he came to my neck of the woods. So now I get to hear people get really excited about Ryan Nall.
Oh, stop it.
Hey, it happened, and we will never forget it. Not quite Jordan Lynch, but not everybody can be. Anyways, let's get into some final burning questions. I would love to add this to Bear With Me, especially during the offseason, or we just take some questions, and we'll start with one from Bear for Life at the Maxter52. He says, Poles could theoretically package 2 second-rounders for a late first, a second, and a third with the Chiefs. If he could, let's talk about trading up in general, because trading 2 picks for 3 picks with a second-rounder back might not happen, but if it's you, Lester, does trading up make sense? Like, forget the nerd stuff. Like, obviously, I'm not a fan of trading up, just like every other number cruncher out there. But do you see trading up as something that fits in this year's plan?
I'm not a fan of trading up, but if you truly believe one of those Buckeye wide receivers is going to be a difference maker for your franchise, and we just saw it happen with the Bengals. You know, they got Joe Burrow's guy. You know, if you are bought all in on Justin Fields, and we don't know if the franchise is yet or not. We think they are. We hope they are. But if they are all in on Fields, there's a chance to move up and get one of his guys, and you believe he can do it, then maybe you go ahead and do it. That other than that, though, I wouldn't trap. I would stay pat and let the board come to you and take the best player available.
We've talked about the Madden image of the upgrade that comes from a flat-out roster hole like Dakota Dozier up to somebody competent. There's too many of those holes. And frankly, I think Pace's teams over the last couple of years, Lester, have done a really, really good job of teaching why you can't have a thin team either. Just because you covered all the holes doesn't mean that you don't need a Nick Kwiatkowski when Roquan Smith goes down in 2019. Like, you got to have players that can step in limited action, because when you're down, gosh, remember that 2020 game where they were having Alex Bars start at center? He'd never played center before in his life. They had Arlington Hambright, who had just gotten called up from the practice squad. I think Latavius Simmons made an appearance in that game.
I think Simmons got hit with COVID.
Oh, you're right.
Before the game, and it was a Rashad Coward special that game. I believe
It was Coward.
It was a rough game.
Leno
against the
never
Tigers.
ever like missed games, so I think he was there, and they'd gotten Ifedi back, but he looked worse than any of them, and I wish that was a joke. Like you can't do that, and so I think whether it's staying where they are or trading back even just a little bit, I think that adding more talent, like more net talent, is better than specific incredible talent, especially because Lester, I mean, I doubt that it's a secret that the Bears roster isn't super good. So if you want that creme de la creme talent, use next year's first. Like you just stay patient and you might end up with a top 10 pick to use one place or another. So another question we've got, this one from Ken. Robert Zaglinski has an article on Windy City Gridiron about the possibility of bringing back Kyle Fuller. What say you? Kick the tires or nah?
Me, yeah. I think having a veteran like him, that's one thing. When he was in Chicago, he was always known for he was a physical corner, and he seemed like he's more of a zone-based corner, which what the Bears are going to run this year. You know, was he 31? You know, he didn't have the greatest year last year in Denver, but you bring him in, he's going to come in at close to vet minimum. You know he's a true professional, and you need a couple of those guys on our roster. You need a few good locker room guys, and yeah, it's not one of Fluss's guys from Indy, but he's a guy you can trust. You can bring him in, and he may compete for a spot outside. I think if you're going to look at Thomas Graham starting over Kyle Fuller, I think Kyle Fuller probably wins that job just because of the experience and he understands it. And you may be stunting Graham's growth a little bit, but if you don't think Thomas Graham's ready for that starting spot, you got to get a starting corner.
So it's funny that you mentioned Graham, because I was going to bring that up. I think there's a human element to this, right? It takes two sides to tango, and a lot of times Bears fans, or not just Bears fans, fans of any team will tell themselves that their team could have just offered a little bit more money and then they would have won that negotiation. And that's not always true. I mean, take a look at Allen Robinson's deal in Los Angeles. I doubt that was the most expensive offer on the table, but it was to go to the now Super Bowl champion. So there's some extra value there. I think if you're going to bring back Kyle Fuller, which I am for, he fits the system, he adds veteran depth, this is better than playing Kindle Vildor. You are bringing him back in a depth role. So that's a demotion. Like, he's coming back to the team that drafted him round 1, and I'm telling him, I don't actually care how well you play in training camp. Graham's starting over you, and you're not playing until somebody gets hurt. And if he's willing to do that, of course, come aboard. But I think that actually would be maybe difficult. I mean, that would be admitting or in Fuller's case, that he's at the end of the road. And Andy Dalton didn't want to do it. Who would, right? A lot of these guys consider themselves starters. I mean, Akeem Hicks is never going to say die. There's a reason that he hasn't been signed, and he would not be a bad signing in Chicago. But I tend to think that Poles wants to completely distance himself from the old regime, which, now that I think about it, maybe the treatment of Akeem Hicks, who would have made sense at 3-Tech, is a sign that Kyle Fuller may just not be on their table purely because he had a long history in Chicago.
Yeah, I'm with that. I would love it. I would love to see both those guys back. I just don't see it happening.
Right. And then a third question that we'll go over is, what do you think, or why do you think the people are so low on the Bears' output this year? By no means, this is from Jordan T. Silvera. By no means am I saying that the Bears are going to the Super Bowl, but you've got all sorts of people saying that they're a bottom 2 roster, that they're definitely going to be awful, that they're definitely going to end up with a top 5 pick. And that seems wild to me, given the turnarounds that we've seen in the NFL, just like even the Texans, who were quote unquote guaranteed to lose all their games, and they certainly didn't. Do you think, Lester, that there is such a thing as taking paper teams and maybe projecting too far into something where coaching can make such a massive impact? And gracious alive, Lester, I'll say something scary. If Justin Fields does take a step that no Chicago quarterback has ever taken, the team gets a lot better really fast.
Yeah, I think it's all about Justin Fields. And I think right now, league-wide, they're not probably as high on him as they were when he was, coming in as a rookie. He did struggle last year. He had a lot of, bad mistakes. And I think that his film that's out there now, some of these analysts look at that and say, you know what, they don't truly believe he's going to take that next step. Then you look at what they have on the roster, and, they did lose a lot of guys. I mean, there was no sexy signings in free agency. I mean, I saw some guys that I think was NFL.com, or it could have been CBS. They were just ripping on the Bears for doing nothing to help Justin Fields. But you look at the roster. I mean, they've done a few things. It wasn't a huge name. They didn't make a big trade for a guy like Metcalf, but they're building the Ryan Poles way. It's not sexy. It's not exciting. And these analysts want to see flash. And right now there's no flash. And then a lot of times you look at, what Matt Nagy did his first year, that's uncommon. Usually the first year you do take a little bit of step back. So I think that's why nationally they're looking at the Bears as they're going to take a step back. But like I said earlier, this team may have a worse record than last year. But I see this team, I see the arrow pointing up. Because I believe in Justin Fields. I think he's the right guy for the job. I just think that he has that makeup where he has that alpha makeup. Nothing's going to phase him. Nothing's going to shake him. He's working hard right now in the offseason. He has that it factor, and we haven't seen that really in a Bears quarterback. I mean, with Mitch, it was there a little bit in shades, but Mitch seems content to kind of be one of the guys. And where Justin Fields, you look at him, he's just like, he's alpha. He's out there. He's front and center. He has that about him. He has the guys working out. I think they're going to be a much better team than what some national pundits believe they will be.
To save you from a Fields Trubisky comparison, because that is a rabbit hole we do not need to go down. One of my favorite things about Justin Fields at this stage is that even into one rookie season that was bad, and we don't need to pretend it was good, if somebody asked, what is Fields good at? We can point to something. Right?
Yeah.
With Mitch, even in his best seasons, he was not so much good at anything as he was decent at everything. Right? He had solid athleticism. He was keeping up a very solid completion percentage. He was running his offense. He was doing this and that. But there wasn't ever really something that you could say Mitch was really good at that. Maybe not turning the ball over, which actually he was quite exceptional at. I mean, truly, Mitch, when you look back, was the quarterback that I think Chicago dreamed of for years that would just hand the ball off, not throw interceptions, and take care of the football. He did. Right? And in Fields' case, he's a very good deep thrower. That's what we know. We saw that at the intermediate and the deep levels, he can be more accurate than other comparison quarterbacks in the NFL, which I think is really important, right? And so we have something that we can say Fields is good at that. Now we need to build off it, and he needs to take the things like the short throws that he was not very good at, fumbles, which he was cataclysmically bad at, sacks, which got a lot better throughout the year. I mean, your sack watch got easier and easier as Fields got more and more game experience. But even so, like, there are things he obviously needs to work on, but at least we know that we had things, or that he's good at something. But at least for me, the primary key over this next month really is I could dream up, Lester, scenarios where the Bears fix themselves, right? Well, they get Tyler Smith and he's a beast. They get Alec Pierce and he's exactly what they need. They sign JC Treader and they're just, yeah. Right now, the Bears wide receiver room taking Allen Robinson as a non-factor, which is not fair. But for the back half of the season, even when he was on the field, he wasn't helpful. The Bears wide receiver room has gotten ever so slightly better because I think Byron Pringle's a better player than Marquise Goodwin and Damiere Byrd put together. Yes. And it felt like it was just Mooney there for a little while. Now it's Mooney plus Pringle. The offensive line has taken a step back. I think Lucas Patrick is a decent upgrade over Sam Mustipher, but they've let Daniels go. And outside of that, the tackles are pretty much the same. If anything, Jason Peters might be a loss worth mentioning here. Until they draft the guys that we think they will draft, we can't say they're better, right?
Yeah.
But they should draft those guys. And once they do, we can say maybe they're at least the same. There's an element of I need to see it to believe it. You know what I mean?
I agree. I think I'm higher than Jenkins and Borum than most Bears fans are. Like I'm high on Jenkins for sure. I think Jenkins is going to be wherever he ends up. I think he's going to be, a damn good football player. I think Borum has a lot of upside. And like I said earlier, if the best he is your swing tackle, that's a win for him. But, he's another guy. He's putting the work in this offseason. He wants to be the starting tackle for the Bears, and he's going to come in and he's going to do everything he can to win that job. And whether they get a guy in the draft like Smith, a guy that come in and play tackle as well, there's, like we talked about, it's a deep class at O-line. Larry Borum's going to have somewhere to fit in that role there. Whether
Absolutely.
it's swing, whether it's right tackle, whether it's left, who knows what they're going to do. They may flip-flop Jenkins and Borum again. I can't wait for some mini camps to see. And hopefully the beat guys are allowed to talk about where these guys are playing, because I want to know where Jenkins is lining up day one of minicamp.
Dying to know.
Day one, where the hell is he at? That's what I want to
Lester,
know.
there's a real world where Poles decides that Tevin Jenkins is he's a mover, he's a displacer, that the offensive or outside zone scheme needs guys that can move people, and they kick him to guard and draft tackles. Like, it would be weird. I think he looked solid as a left tackle, but there's an option there. So like you're saying, I mean, like, we need to get to that point. I wish I could see in the future and be like, who's on the team? Let me talk about who's on the team. But instead, we got to wait a couple months. Sounds like as we close up, Lester, we're getting reports that Matthew Adams, a linebacker from the Colts, is now reporting that he is, in fact, a Chicago Bear. So another linebacker added, which that makes...
From the Colts, right?
Yes. And if memory serves, that's going to put them at 4 linebackers at this stage. I'm already counting Anthony Hitchens, and I shouldn't. So 3.
Well, they did pick up 4. Joe Thomas, and they picked up another guy early in free agency. They were street free agents. They're more athletic guys. It was Joe Thomas and Noah Dawkins. They're classic special team guys. But again, they fit the Eberflus mold because they are young, athletic, and hungry, and they may not be nothing more than a depth guy. But that's quality what the Bears need right now.
Let me put it this way, Lester, because what I'm really watching for is how much better are they getting under the assumption that where they place a stopgap, they don't want to draft someone. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right, like, I would expect a better stopgap at X receiver if this wasn't the case, and we didn't get one. So if they had signed DJ Chark, I would have expected them to not draft Christian Watson, right? But they didn't. They signed Nicholas Morrow. They signed Justin Jones. So they need somebody to be the guy at this point. Or else I don't know if that's where their draft is targeting. But honestly, the more I think about that could be me working the Ouija board a little too hard and starting to see things that aren't there. You know,
well, they're adding guys on defense. They're adding guys that fit the scheme on defense. You know, they're bringing here's another guy from the Colts. He knows the scheme. He can help them kind of transition. You know, I got to dig into him a little more. If he's the guy I think he is, I know he started a few games last year for the Colts. I'm not sure. I have to dig back into it. But I know as soon as they hired Matt Eberflus, I looked at the Colts free agency right away because I figured they're going to bring in at least one guy from
like
over
Al-Qadim Muhammad.
Yeah,
you could see it from space.
Awesome. Yeah, that was a no-brainer. I figured they'd bring in some linebackers. You know, I know they have a corner, they have a safety that are still free. We'll see what happens. But now they have at least 2 help with the scheme transition. So plug in those holes on defense, which again sets you up to take the best player available on offense in the draft.
I am so excited for this defense. I feel like I shouldn't be. It's not like it's an inventive scheme. If anything, the Bears.
I love the scheme. I love the Lovie Smith Tampa 2 style. I love the way they play, the hits philosophy. I love that meatball kind of stuff. You look at it, it's corny. No, I love it. I played football. I coach football. I love that. The Eminem boys. I love all those little things he uses to kind of put it out there. And I'll tell you what, players eat that stuff up too.
Yep.
You know, as long as they understand this is what I expect of you, I'm holding you accountable with the loafs. You're loafing. I'm holding you accountable. This is the hits philosophy. The players love that. You know, there'll be some that don't like it. They'll be like, this is not for me.
And when they get a loaf, obviously they're not going to be like, yes.
Yeah. But the players that don't buy in, they're going to get the hell out as quickly and they'll find a brand new guy to come in and they will take that spot, and it's going to be fun.
And another thing that I want to mention, so whenever I've got defensive questions, I tend to go talk to somebody I've had on the podcast a lot, Brandon Robinson, who's not only coordinated defense at the high school level, and also coached DBs in like a professional level, though, arena football at the time. I don't need to read off his whole biography. But the point is, he pointed something out about Sean Desai's defense that I never would have caught, which is that by the back half of the season, they were letting guys take on roles that they just weren't good at. And it almost suggests that Eddie Jackson asked to play slot corner, for instance, and got his way in some man scenarios. That as inventive as that Sean Desai defense started, that we might have at least partially see it fade because the players got to experiment with kind of whatever they wanted to do. Whereas Eberflus's system is much more rigid. That's not what we do here, guys. They're gonna, of course, have different tags for how they'll play different receivers and different offenses. You're gonna play the Packers differently than you're gonna play the Jets, for instance. But the scheme is the scheme. That they're not reinventing the wheel, which I know Nagy and his whole staff had a real problem with during the last 4 years of our lives, for crying out loud. That I'm interested to see this low investment, high yield defense. That the whole goal, at least, seems to be, let's get more out than we put in. I'm curious as to whether we're going to see that continue going forward, by the way, of just, are they going to invest heavy resources into the defense, or is the plan, as unusual as it would be for a defense-oriented head coach, is the plan to build a 35 to 40% defensive investment, 60 to 65% offensive investment football team with the ideal of, we're going to invest 15th, maybe lower, and we're going to yield 10th or higher. Does that make sense?
That's the dream. I mean, that's today's NFL. Today's NFL is offense oriented. It's the rules have been changed. Once you get the quarterback figured out, everything falls into place. But that's where the Bears are now. They're still kind of in a holding pattern. Is Justin Fields the guy? If he's the guy, a lot of these problems the Bears have go away. If he's the guy, the receivers, the tight ends, the line, it'll all get figured out. If he's the guy, that's the next step. But it's exciting times. The defense is coming together, setting things up for the draft.
Super exciting times. And speaking of exciting times, Lester, we have a lot to plug lately. Yeah. Not only are we going to get back to more consistent podcasts and streams as the draft ramps up, not only is Windy City Gridiron's Lunch Pail Draft Cast with Danny Meehan, Jacob Infante, and whoever else they want to have on going to continue moving, but we are going to be live streaming on this channel, Run Pass Opinion, day 2 of the NFL Draft, which should really be awesome. It's going to be me, Jeff Burkus, Jacob Infante, and a whole host of other WCG madmen, as we'll be talking about not only the picks that are happening, but especially once the Bears make picks, we're going to start breaking them down immediately. We're going to get film out. We're going to talk about not only what they're good at, but what we're seeing, what we've got to look forward to in this next 2022 Bears season. This should be a really fun show. I'm really excited about it. So mark your calendars for day 2 of the draft. We will be live throughout. Lester, anything else that you're looking for?
That's what I'm excited for. I mean, it's the first time that we've done something at this magnitude. It's going to be a lot of fun. We got a lot of cool podcast stuff coming up that goes along with that. A lot of cool video stuff that goes along with it, obviously. So subscribe to Robert's Run Past Opinion. Subscribe to our Second City Gridiron YouTube channel as well, because that's where we're going to put some of the pod stuff we're going to cut up from the show. We're going to put it on there, and it's going to be a lot of fun.
That's really key. If you want to do Windy City Gridiron a favor, and I hope you would, because it's near and dear to my heart, take a look in the description and subscribe to Second City Gridiron. We want to get that subscriber count above 1,000 so that YouTube considers it legitimate, because as corny as it sounds, that stuff matters. So drop a subscription. We'll have more content, even some of some analytical stuff from me. It's going to be coming out on that channel, so make sure you're subscribed to it. You're doing us a favor, and also you'll get some cool stuff out of it. Thank you so much for sticking with us, everybody. It's been super fun. Lester, any final thoughts before we pop off?
Let's get the hell out of here.
Let's get the heck out of here. Awesome. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll see you next time. Bear down. And thanks so much for bearing with me. Sweet. Both recordings are saved. I had to make... I'm not doing that again. And you know what? Worst case scenario, Lester, I could pull the audio out of YouTube. So, truly, if they can hear us, we're good to go. I will throw something at you before we get out of here, because it's about 8 p.m. on a Friday. We've got things we can do. But new poster, one of the commenters said, I think there's a baseline of offensive line play you need to have before your offense can function. Regardless of Fields, the line needs to get to that baseline, and it doesn't seem like it's there yet. Do you agree?
Are we live right now?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It's me and JB talked about this on our other show, Bear and Balance. I'd rather have an offensive line that has 5 good guys that work together than have an offensive line with 2 studs and then 3 guys you're worried about. I think right now the Bears are kind of hovering around that point where they're just passable. You know, we talk about Jenkins, talk about Borum, we talk about Patrick. Cody Whitehair had a down year last year, but he's young enough to bounce back. I think he'll be fine in the new scheme. I think right now it's all about having 5 guys you trust, and that's why I think there's going to be a veteran or two signing coming up soon here that they trust for that spot to go along with a rookie.
Right.
If the rookie comes in and wins a job, great. Or 2. If the rookie comes in and wins a job, that's awesome. That helps the depth of the team now, because then those guys that you thought were going to be signed as veteran starters are now your veteran backup. So, yeah, I agree with that. I think you got to have a baseline on the O-line, and if they're competent, it helps everything out. But so much in pass pro goes with what the quarterback's doing and what the scheme's doing.
Right.
I break down sack watch for 10 years now, and half the sacks aren't even the fault of the offensive line. It's the quarterback, or it's the scheme, or it's the receivers doing something goofy. It's hard to tell exactly on some of these, but some of these just it's just so obvious, not the O-line.
Right.
It's just get those guys competent. Luke Getsy's scheme, we haven't seen it firsthand. We don't know what's going to happen, but judging off the success this system has had throughout the league, judging where he's come from, what he's learned the last few years, whether it's with Joe Moorhead, the stuff he learned there, I'm excited to see what's going to happen. That he's the big reason why I'm confident the Bears' offense will be better, is because Matt Nagy's ridiculous offense. It's not even a Coach Reed system. I don't know what the hell Matt Nagy ran in Chicago. I have no idea what it was. The only thing I know is it's not the I formation. That's what he didn't want to run. So,
right. Which you didn't even. That's not
good.
even you saying you wanted the I formation. You just wanted a better plan than the smattering of plays we ended up getting. I thought there might be some cohesion.
No rhyme
really
or reason
together for a moment, but we didn't get it. I'll say this, Lester, because I want to be that positive. This is really the one area of the team that I can be optimistic, because the draft is around the corner, but a little negative. I can tell you with a straight face that I hope Dakota Dozier gets cut. He's
not going to make it. He's
the starting right guard, Lester.
He's a practice squad level guy.
Oh, yeah.
He's coming in because he is coming from a Kubiak system, which is very close to a Shanahan system. Same basic system philosophy up front. I think that's why he's coming in. He's a veteran that understands the scheme. He's going to come in. He may make the roster as your last O-lineman. My guess is he's probably a practice squad guy at best.
Oh, sure. What I'm trying to say, Lester, is
right now he's a starter. Yeah,
we don't disagree.
It's disgusting.
It's more that I agree with the sentiment that the Bears need to add. They've got to add 1 to 2 linemen, whether that's in the draft, probably in the draft alone. And then they need to probably add a couple more reserves. Whether that's a big name like JC Treader, and then it turns out Lucas Patrick is the reserve, he'd understand. It's a business, which he'd be a solid OL6 for sure, or whatever else that may be, because I need to go look at the actual free agents and come up with a list myself, or some cut candidate. It was not so long ago that it wasn't Matt Slauson, it was Josh Sitton. Became a Chicago Bear overnight. So we'll see.
Moved Cody Whitehair to center, who was set to be a guard.
Right.
That's why I said when everyone heard Patrick, he said he's a center. He's a center.
We don't know.
Shit happens. I mean, he could not be a center in 3 weeks because some guy could be available. He's a better center. Move him to guard.
Right.
Long way between now and training camp. Things change.
And thank God, because the sentiment that says that if we rolled the ball out tomorrow and played a game, I wouldn't be able to sleep tonight because of the nightmares that I'd get of what Justin Fields would have to run from. I vibe with that. I mean, it's not like I am stoked about the offensive line as it stands right now, but I do agree with you. I mean, there are a lot of Bears fans that I personally think forget that the offensive line isn't supposed to look like they do at an all-star game. They had so little cohesion, which is pretty shocking given that a lot of that offensive line played together in training camp. And yes, there were plenty of injuries. Of course there were. But I remember, Lester, a game that gnawed at my brain for the last 2 years now. In 2020, the Cincinnati Bengals had all 5 of their starting linemen out for injury. All 5 of them. And they played a cohesive game. They ran the ball for 100 yards. Joe Burrow only took like 4 sacks. All 5 of your starting line were injured, and yet they played together. The Bears seemed like they could have all 5 of their starting linemen playing, and somebody would make a mistake, if not 2 people. I do think that the Mustafa, let's call it a benching, is well earned. I think that Patrick, even if he is the starter, is probably a step up, certainly just athletically from there. But they've got to add an offensive line, or it won't. Like, we will be complaining about it later.
I mean, there's guys out there, there's some tackles that are on the market that you look at, you say, you can come in and start. The guy with the Colts, with the Chiefs before. Eric Fisher. He's not the greatest guy, but he's a capable starting lineman in the NFL.
I still want to know, Lester, if they do sign Fisher, which I actually think makes a lot of sense. Yeah. I think a Fisher signing, I don't want to call it likely because that makes it sound like I know something, but it just makes a lot of sense.
If you connect the dots, it makes sense.
The question that I would have to answer is, okay, so Eric Fisher is coming to town. He's probably starting. Then what? Because now you have 3 tackles. And I think Borum would make a terrible guard. So
yeah, I'm not high on that move.
Does that mean Fisher would be signaling a Jenkins guard move? Like, in a world of draft best 5 or like play the best 5 guys, that would still probably be 5 good guys. I mean, like, I don't want to sound like I'm over the moon, Lester. The last thing I ever want to sound like is some like hyper, or what's the word? Oh my gosh, the super exaggeration starts with an H. I'm having like hyperbole. Yeah, hyperbolic. Hyperbolic. Yeah. Homer. But I actually think Tevin Jenkins could be like an all-pro at guard. I think he has the makeup to be a good tackle, but guard asks players to not just hit your guy, but like move them out of the way. And Jenkins is a fighter. Like, I'm sure you saw the same thing that I did, but it's cool watching what he did in that second game. The first one, the Minnesota Vikings game, he looked like he was still hurt. But once he'd knocked the rust off a little bit, that second game he played, he was shucking guys. I mean, it was fun. And if they did that at guard, that would be something I could certainly get behind. If Patrick, who's known for his athleticism, and Jenkins, and let's say Larry Borum, or maybe that could be Eric Fisher, became a right side of the offensive line that we got used to watching big gains come from in the run game. I mean, it would make sense. And plus, it's not Poles' second-round pick. So, like you said, in the eyes of Tevin Jenkins, he's not a second and a third-round pick. He's a guy Ryan Pace handed him. Like, draft status doesn't matter anymore. I'm dying to know what they're going to do there. It's not even like I'm excited for guard. Sometimes I think I can make it sound that way, Lester, because tackle's a much more valuable position, but tackle's, dare I say it, almost easier to acquire, right? And frankly, here's a weird one. If things really went their way, right? If things really went the Bears' way, do you think there's a chance that they cut or trade Cody Whitehair?
If you look at the money says no. Because if you get rid of Cody,
definitely not.
If you get rid of Cody Whitehair, you actually take on a dead cap. There's no savings with Cody Whitehair. I think
you can June 1st him for a little bit of savings.
They've already June 1st 2 players. They June 1st Trevathan and Cohen. And you're only allowed to do June 1st to 2 different players on a roster.
So you got to remember, Lester, you're only allowed to pre-designate 2 players.
Oh, is that the deal?
You can only, I mean,
I got to talk to Brad Spielberg. I got to get my
Lester. This is easy to
explain. Salary cap.
This is easier to explain than you think.
Okay, let's hear it.
They have a 90-man roster and they cut people, and it's after June 1st. Like,
it's still not much of a savings. If anything, it's a hit.
No.
Plus, I mean, at the worst case scenario, if Cody Whitehair, let's say he is the guy from last year, it's still a better backup than Dakota Dozier.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I agree with you. If they cut Cody Whitehair, it would literally be a matter of we are resetting the offensive line.
They better have a better plan in place. Yeah.
Yeah. So that would get you mad if they cut Cody Whitehair for no reason.
Yeah.
I can see that. I wonder aloud how serious Poles is about resetting the line. You know, we've heard that a lot. We've heard the whole, he doesn't like any of these guys. You know what I mean? Not liking them is one thing, but you do have to have that plan in place. So I'm just curious because in a world where theoretically, Lester, I saw Curtis Pop mention something like this, but say that they drafted Tyler Smith and they wanted to play him at guard. And then a guy named Dylan Parham out of or
I
Cole
watched some of his
Strange.
film. Yeah.
Yeah. Parham's out of
Memphis,
Memphis,
the Memphis guy.
and Strange is out of Chattanooga, but both look like solid outside zone guards. So they draft them, and maybe they want to play him a little sooner. I could understand the why behind what they're doing, but also Cody Whitehair. I'm thinking aloud. I think he's the most experienced veteran player on offense right now, bar none. And if he's not, it's the new tight end. So, like, it's a young team, even already. And you can't just have all young guys.
I think Cody sticks. I think he sticks around. It just makes no sense to get rid of him. Another vet or two's coming. A rookie or two's coming. They'll be fine. You know, they'll have all camp to gel and working together. Like I said, that first training camp, I'm going to be all over Twitter looking for the pictures if they have them, or looking for the beat guys. You know, where are these linemen lined up at? I want to know what Borum is doing. I want to know what Jenkins is doing. You know, I want to know who's at right guard. I want to know where these guys are, because, you know, hopefully with this new the new offensive scheme, they don't want to flip these guys around. Hopefully they put them in their spot and they let them do their thing.
Well, Lester, there's always the other option, and so our wonderful viewers, I will say this: if you make enough noise, change happens. So if you want to get Lester Wiltfong to training camp and you want to try to help get Windy City Gridiron an official credit, we just need people to yell enough for that to happen. But, you know, barring that, like you're saying, we'll just have to read and see what Adam Johns or our own guy Zach Pearson from the Bear Report sees at those first days of camp, because I know they don't crack open camp to the public, though I wish they would. Lester, anything before we get out of here? Because we're hitting the hour and a half mark. I think we got a nice show.
We're good. It's time to eat. I got to go eat some dinner. I'm starving.
Sounds great. Guys, thanks so much for checking it out. We're going to see or if I can think of a decent topic to stream about every week, we'll get on streaming again every week. Right now is draft stuff. Maybe we'll just watch film together. We'll see. But I want to get back into edited content. Support.
I can't wait for that Pierce, the Pierce show you're going to do, the Alec Pierce video.
Well, it's basically the same thing as the one on Twitter, but I'm going to spin it and dive a little deeper, just a little deeper. But yeah,
with some fancy graphics and stuff. Yeah.
Very excited. Very excited about it. But Jeremy, thanks so much for the support. I saw that during the middle of the podcast and wish that I could say something, but we were in the middle of live recording. Podcast will be up on Apple soon. If you didn't listen to the whole thing, you can check it out there. Thanks so much, everybody. Bear down and have a great weekend.